In the frozen Wild West, a lone rancher buys a woman no one else wanted, taking in her children too, but behind his gentle smile lurked a plan darker than anyone could imagine. The dawn broke pale and bitter over the frontier plains, the first fragile light catching the edges of a low-hanging mist that clung to the fences and the worn paths of the auction yard. Snow, light and powdery, drifted in slow circles, settling on the dry earth and the sparse tufts of grass that stubbornly clung to life despite the cold. The women huddled against the wind, the children pressed close to her, their small bodies trembling beneath threadbare layers that offered little protection. She lifted them both into her arms, rocking them gently, whispering promises that felt almost like prayers, though her own heart trembled with despair. Around her, men and women murmured, some with curiosity, most with indifference, their eyes sliding past her as if she were invisible, their whispered jokes sharp and cruel. She knelt on the frozen ground, one hand clutching the younger child, the other smoothing the hair of the older one. "Please," she begged, her voice ragged and raw, "please, my children." The words barely reached the ears of the auctioneer, a thin man with a sun-scorched face and a crooked smile, who gestured with impatience at the crowd, ready to move on. No one stepped forward. Her desperation seemed to weigh less than the coins they would have spent on whiskey or a new saddle. The children clung to her skirts, their eyes wide, reflecting fear, cold, and hunger in equal measure. Each passing moment tightened the grip of hopelessness around her chest. From the back of the yard, a figure watched silently. He stood just beyond the cluster of bidding men, a quiet presence almost swallowed by the gray haze of morning. Broad-shouldered, lean, with eyes that measured rather than judged, he exuded a calm that contrasted sharply with the shifting panic of the woman in front of him. The faint scars on his hands told of hard work, of battles fought in silence and solitude, yet there was no arrogance in his posture, no need for spectacle. He observed the auction with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting, the wind tugging at his coat, curling his dark hair into his forehead. The crowd shifted restlessly, the murmurs growing louder, yet no one approached the woman. She sobbed quietly, the sound almost lost in the hiss of the wind over the plains. "Someone, anyone, please," she whispered again, clutching the children closer. One of the men at the front smirked, throwing a derisive glance over his shoulder. "Not worth the coin," he muttered, shaking his head. The auctioneer nodded, ready to move on, when the rancher finally stepped forward, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. His voice, low and measured, carried without effort, "I'll take her." The yard fell silent. Men glanced at each other in disbelief, then at the figure who had chosen her. His gaze, steady and unreadable, rested on the woman. He offered only what was necessary, a sum so small it drew a ripple of snickers from the crowd. Yet in that simple gesture lay an authority they could neither challenge nor understand. The woman stared at him, confusion and disbelief mingling with a cautious hope. "Yours, for what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Enough to bring you and them to safety," he replied, his tone soft, almost gentle, though his eyes remained hard and unreadable. "They're ours now." There was no flourish, no show of generosity, only a quiet assurance that startled her more than any grand gesture could have. The auctioneer accepted the coin, muttering under his breath, and the crowd began to disperse, leaving the woman and her children alone with the man who had intervened. She remained on her knees, staring up at him, and for the first time since arriving at the yard, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of safety. The walk to the ranch was slow, deliberate, the children bundled against the wind in makeshift layers provided by the rancher. He carried the younger child with ease, his arms steady, while she supported the older one. Snow swirled around them, catching in the woman's hair and frosting her eyelashes, yet she hardly noticed. She watched him carefully, noting the way he navigated the rough path, how he seemed to anticipate each obstacle with quiet certainty. There was something in the steadiness of his movements that inspired trust, though she could not yet define it. The ranch itself appeared like a refuge from the chaos of the world, a modest cabin surrounded by rough-hewn fences and the low, rolling hills of the frontier. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the gray morning air, bringing with it the scent of pine and smoldering wood. The door opened before they reached it, and warmth spilled out in contrast to the chill outside. He ushered them in without ceremony, lighting a small fire in the hearth and handing them blankets, his actions precise and careful, each one designed to reassure. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. Rough wooden furniture bore the marks of years of use, yet everything had its place, from the worn rug at the hearth to the neatly stacked firewood in the corner. The woman's eyes swept over the room, taking in the flickering shadows cast by the fire, the subtle smell of leather and smoke, and the faint metallic tang of tools left from earlier work. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt a cautious sense of relief. The rancher moved quietly, preparing food with a care that spoke of routine, but also of attentiveness. He handed the children bowls of stew, watching them eat with a soft expression that made the woman's chest tighten. The smallest smiles, tentative and wary, flickered across the children's faces, and she felt a warmth she had thought long extinguished. The rancher's own movements were deliberate but not showy. He did not seek recognition, only to ensure their safety and comfort. As the day wore on, the wind howled outside, rattling the cabin walls and tugging at the door. The woman, now seated by the fire, allowed herself to observe him more closely. He carried the weight of solitude in his posture, but there was also a quiet strength, a patience that suggested he had endured hardship and come through it hardened, yet not entirely unfeeling. Each small gesture, the careful folding of blankets, the way he checked the children's temperatures, the soft humming as he worked, added layers to her understanding of him. Even as she began to trust him, a flicker of caution remained. The world had been cruel, and the kindness of strangers had often been a prelude to more suffering. She studied his eyes, searching for deceit, but found only depth and reserve. The children, meanwhile, clung to him with a mixture of curiosity and burgeoning comfort, their small hands brushing against his as he handed them food or lifted them from chairs. Night fell over the plains, thick and dark, and the fire cast long, wavering shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the snow continued its silent descent, muffling sound and creating a fragile cocoon around the isolated homestead. The woman sat near the hearth, the children at her side, and felt a rare, trembling hope take root. The rancher moved through the room with quiet purpose, checking the windows, tending the fire, ensuring that nothing threatened the fragile peace they had found. As the evening deepened, he finally sat opposite her, the firelight reflecting in his steady gaze. There was no need for words, and yet something unspoken passed between them, a shared recognition of survival, of the precariousness of life on the frontier, and of the fragile thread that had drawn them together. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin again, but inside, there was a momentary stillness, a pause in the endless motion of fear and survival. The morning light filtered through the narrow cabin windows, pale and diffused, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The snow outside had thickened overnight, layering the ground in crisp white, and the wind whispered against the wooden walls, tugging at the edges of the door and rattling the shutters. Inside, the smell of wood smoke mingled with the faint aroma of oatmeal simmering on the stove. The woman stirred quietly, the older child nestled against her side, the younger still curled in the crook of her arm. She glanced toward the corner where the rancher sat sharpening a knife, his movements precise, almost meditative. Every so often, his gaze flicked toward the children, not with indulgence but with an attentive caution that suggested he was already imagining dangers they could not yet see. He glanced up as she rose, offering a slight nod. No words were needed. His presence alone conveyed the quiet promise of protection. She followed him outside as he prepared the small pen for the animals, her boots crunching against the snow. The rancher moved with an economy of motion born of years alone in the wilderness, each step deliberate, measured, and purposeful. He hoisted feed sacks with ease, tossed hay into mangers with practiced precision, and checked the fences along the perimeter, his eyes scanning the horizon for movement or signs of threat. Though silent, he radiated competence, and the woman found herself leaning on that presence in ways she had long since forgotten. The children scampered beside her, laughing softly as the cold air burned their cheeks. The older one attempted to mimic the rancher's motions, picking up straw and tossing it into the trough with an unsteady hand. He chuckled quietly, watching without interruption, then knelt to steady the child's aim with a gentle hand. That touch, brief and unassuming, was a gesture she felt deep in her chest. Trust, she realized, was slowly stitching itself into the fabric of her heart, thread by cautious thread. By midday the wind had sharpened, whipping snow into brief flurries that scoured the ground and stung bare skin. They returned to the cabin, their boots leaving prints in the fresh white, only to find a small stranger at the edge of the fence line, a dog, thin, shivering, and matted. The rancher observed it quietly, assessing its demeanor before stepping forward. The woman's instinct was to caution him, to fear for what small disorder the animal might bring, but instead, he knelt and extended a hand, speaking softly in a tone that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the wind. The dog hesitated, then crept toward him, body low and tentative, until it rested its chin in his palm. Watching him coax life from the fearful animal, the woman felt a surge of warmth and admiration. This man, she realized, was not merely strong and capable but patient in ways the world had not demanded from her. She saw it in the care he took, in the respect with which he treated even a stray creature. The children were delighted, patting the dog and giggling as it wagged its tail in hesitant approval. For a moment the cabin felt like more than a refuge, it felt like home. As the sun waned, casting long shadows across the snow, subtle threats began to press in from the edges of the world. A figure passed across the horizon, distant but noticeable, silhouetted against the pale light. The rancher paused mid-step, squinting toward the movement, hand instinctively resting near his knife. The woman felt a shiver of unease and glanced at the children, whose laughter had ceased. Yet he said nothing, his silence a mixture of warning and reassurance. The flitting shadows, the strange marks on distant trees, the low, almost imperceptible rumble of horse hooves in the distance, they all suggested danger, though it had not yet arrived. That evening they huddled around the fire once more. The children ate their stew in small, eager bites, while the woman studied the rancher as he worked silently, cleaning tools and preparing firewood. The soft crackle of the flames filled the room, mingling with the subtle groans of the cabin under the weight of the storm outside. He moved without distraction, yet every so often his eyes flicked toward the window or the children, a shadow of vigilance beneath the calm exterior. The woman noticed it now, these subtle signals of preparedness, the tiny gestures that betrayed a man accustomed to anticipating trouble. She allowed herself to trust him, but her instincts, honed by loss and hardship, whispered caution. Night deepened and the wind surged against the cabin walls. She sat close to the fire, the children asleep at her side, and let herself remember what it was to feel safe, if only for a moment. The rancher's presence was steady, quiet, and unwavering. He brought her a cup of water, placing it near her without a word, and then retreated to check the locks and the windows. When he returned, he simply nodded once and resumed his own quiet vigil by the fire. It was in these small, wordless gestures that the woman felt the first tendrils of something she could not yet name, something like hope, tempered by the memory of betrayals past. The next morning brought a thin, pale light, and with it, the subtleties of routine. The rancher rose before dawn, tending to the animals, repairing broken fences, and checking the horizon with a patient scrutiny. The woman followed him, carrying a bundle of firewood, each movement deliberate. Their conversation was sparse, punctuated by the occasional instruction or observation, yet there was comfort in the rhythm, in the shared labor that demanded attention more than words. The children laughed and played in the snow, their energy a bright contrast to the muted tones of the landscape. The woman felt herself smiling more freely than she had in months, perhaps years, and marveled at the quiet effectiveness of his presence in her life. But shadows lingered. Strange sounds carried on the wind, hoofbeats too distant to trace, the snap of twigs under unseen feet, the faint shimmer of movement across the snow. She mentioned them quietly, noting her unease, and watched him as he scanned the horizon. He gave her only a measured glance, neither dismissive nor alarmed, and returned to his work. There was a calm authority in his response, a sense that he had weathered storms both literal and figurative before, and she felt herself surrendering bit by bit to the protection he offered. By the evening, the storm had intensified. Snow drove against the cabin walls, wind howling like a chorus of distant wolves. Inside they huddled near the fire, the children exhausted and asleep, their breaths shallow and even. The woman's hand brushed the rancher's briefly as she reached for a blanket. He did not flinch or withdraw. The touch was unspoken reassurance, a subtle acknowledgement of shared endurance in a harsh world. Outside, the night pressed against the cabin, but inside, the warmth of fire, food, and quiet companionship formed a fragile cocoon of safety. The night's calm was broken by the sudden, distant crack of a branch snapping under pressure, echoing across the snowy plains. The woman stiffened, heart hammering. He glanced toward the sound, eyes narrowing, hand moving near his knife, and then returned to the hearth with a slow, controlled breath. "Nothing yet," he murmured, almost to himself. The woman exhaled, relief mingling with lingering anxiety. It was clear he had seen such threats before, and his measured reaction both comforted and unnerved her. The wind carried a sharper edge that morning, slicing through the plains with a biting insistence, rattling the cabin's shutters and stirring the snow into fleeting white spirals. Inside, the woman stirred before dawn, the children still asleep beside her, their breaths shallow and even. She watched the rancher move with his usual precision, gathering firewood and checking the animals in the pen. But today, something in his posture struck her as different, a tension beneath the practiced calm, subtle but unmistakable. She traced her gaze over him, noticing the brief flickers of thought in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when he imagined the horizon, and a quiet unease settled in her chest. Later, as the children played near the cabin, the woman ventured out to help with chores. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and the cold seemed sharper than before, as though the landscape itself were pressing down on them. The rancher worked silently, his hands steady, but she caught the occasional glance he cast toward the distant hills, his expression unreadable. There had always been an air of mystery around him, but now it carried weight, a sense that decisions had been made beyond her knowledge, threads of intention weaving quietly beneath the surface. Her curiosity stirred uneasily. While sweeping the porch, her hand brushed against a half-buried bundle tucked behind a stack of firewood, a small collection of papers, yellowed and carefully folded. She unfolded them cautiously, and her eyes widened at the sight of letters and maps, some marked with names, others with symbols she did not recognize. Her pulse quickened as she pieced together connections she had not known existed, tracing lines between names, dates, and places. Patterns emerged, and with them, a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. The rancher's acts of kindness, his quiet attentiveness, the careful watching over her and the children, all of it had been part of a larger design. She swallowed hard, her stomach twisting. When she confronted him, the words stuck in her throat at first. He was in the cabin, tending the hearth, the firelight dancing across his face, showing the sharp planes of his jaw and the dark depth of his eyes. She asked, her voice trembling yet steady, "Why did you bring us here?" His gaze lifted slowly, meeting hers, and for a heartbeat, nothing passed between them but the crackle of the flames. Then he spoke, calm, precise, his voice carrying an edge she had never noticed before. "I did not rescue you out of mercy," he said. "Everything I have done, every small kindness, every act of protection, was calculated. You and your children are pieces in a game I have long been playing." The words landed like stones in her chest. She felt the warmth of trust drain from her, replaced by a cold, gnawing clarity. Memories of the weeks spent in his care, the meals, the blankets, the subtle gestures, replayed with a new, bitter meaning. She saw the careful watchfulness, the way he anticipated threats, now as preparation for control rather than protection. Anger surged, mingled with fear, and she clenched her fists to steady herself. He remained calm, almost serene, as though revealing this truth were a matter of routine, not consequence. Outside, the wind had shifted again, carrying distant sounds of movement across the snow. The woman's mind raced, connecting the dots between the rancher's careful knowledge of the frontier, his preparedness for danger, and the symbols on the papers she had discovered. He had orchestrated their safety only to serve a purpose she could scarcely yet understand. A revenge that required her as bait, her children as leverage. A storm of emotions churned within her. Betrayal, grief, and a burgeoning determination that she would not be a pawn in someone else's design. The children, sensing the shift in the air, pressed closer to her. She gathered them into her arms, holding them tight against the cold, the fear, and the uncertainty. The rancher's expression remained unreadable, his eyes dark and calculating, but she no longer saw him as a savior. Every lesson he had imparted, every comfort he had offered, was now tinged with a cruel intent she could not ignore. The realization hardened her resolve. She would protect her children at any cost, even if it meant confronting the man who had seemed their guardian. That afternoon, as the snow swirled in blinding sheets, the woman explored the cabin more closely, seeking clues, tools, and any advantage she might find. She discovered hidden compartments, sharpened knives, and notes detailing routes through the mountains, potential ambush points, and connections to men who had wronged the rancher in the past. The careful, methodical preparation that had seemed benign now revealed itself as meticulous plotting. He had calculated every move, considered every variable, and her presence had been part of the strategy all along. By evening, the tension had thickened into a near-physical weight. The children slept fitfully, murmuring in their dreams, while the woman stood near the window, looking out at the storm-lashed plains. The wind tore at the cabin, carrying with it whispers of the outside world, a world she would have to navigate alone if the truth of the rancher's plan came fully to pass. She traced the horizon, imagining escape routes, places to hide, paths where the snow might conceal them, and felt the first sparks of strategy ignite within her. She was no longer merely a victim. The quiet resilience that had kept her alive in harsher circumstances now rose to the surface, sharp and insistent. The rancher entered then, carrying a bundle of firewood. He paused when he saw her, a small, deliberate smile playing on his lips, the calm authority she had once found comforting now a source of unease. He placed the wood in the hearth and spoke casually as though nothing had changed. "The storm will ease by dawn," he said. His words carried both reassurance and subtle assertion, a reminder that he remained in control. She met his gaze, steady and unflinching, and for the first time she realized that confrontation was inevitable. Night deepened and the storm raged on. The woman gathered her thoughts, checking the children, ensuring their blankets were secure, and preparing quietly for what might come. She moved through the cabin with a precision that mirrored the rancher's own methodical care, her actions deliberate, each one advancing her readiness. The wind's howl and the creaking timbers outside were now accompaniments to a growing sense of inevitability. She knew that the truth, once fully faced, would demand action. A sudden crack of wood from the loft made her start. The rancher's footsteps paused outside the room, then continued with measured quiet. She exhaled slowly, heart still racing, and adjusted the children in her arms. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her, unpredictable, fierce, and relentless. Yet in that chaos she found a strange clarity. She would not run blindly, nor would she submit to manipulation. She would watch, wait, and act when the moment demanded it. As the first hints of dawn pierced the storm clouds, she stood by the hearth, looking at the rancher who had so carefully built trust, and now seemed to hold nothing but calculation. The children slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the revelations that threatened to shatter the fragile stability of their world. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly, white and cold, but filled with possibility, paths untraced, choices yet to be made. She pressed the children closer, feeling the warmth of their small bodies, and a determined resolve took root. The wind had risen to a violent howl by the time dawn broke, rattling the cabin with a relentless insistence. Snow swirled in chaotic eddies across the plains, driven by gusts that cut like knives through wool and leather. The woman stood at the hearth, her hands clutching the children, her eyes sharp and alert. The rancher had not yet emerged, but the tension in the air was unmistakable, charged with the knowledge that the calm they had known was gone. Every shadow in the cabin, every creak of timber carried a warning. She had spent the night planning, tracing the lines of escape and confrontation in her mind, each calculation sharpened by fear and determination. She would not be caught off guard again. The first sound of his footsteps was soft against the snow-crusted floor, deliberate and unhurried. When he entered, carrying the authority he had always worn like a second skin, the woman did not flinch. Instead, she met his gaze with steady resolve. He noticed the difference immediately, the tension in her shoulders, the fire in her eyes that had once been cautious, now tempered with defiance. "The storm will ease soon," he said, his voice deceptively calm as if nothing had changed. She held the children closer and shook her head. "I don't need your mercy," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of a storm within her chest. "And I won't let you take them." The rancher paused, eyes narrowing slightly, intrigued more than angered. He stepped closer, each movement controlled, a predator testing the edges of a cornered prey. But she did not retreat. The children pressed against her, sensing the shift in the air, their small hands clutching her skirts. She adjusted their positions, ensuring they were safe and shielded while her own heart pounded like a drum in her chest. The wind howled through broken shutters, scattering loose embers from the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls, and the cabin seemed to shrink around them, a crucible of confrontation. He spoke then, deliberately, his tone almost conversational. "You've learned the truth," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the scattered papers and maps she had discovered. "And yet you stay. Brave or foolish?" She did not answer immediately, only watched him, gauging his movements, noticing the way the lines of his face hardened in the flickering firelight. Her mind raced, replaying every gesture of his over the past weeks, every act of kindness now tainted by intention. Yet beneath the betrayal, beneath the shock, she felt something stronger, clarity. The rancher advanced slowly, knife at his belt, a storm in the eye of the wind, confident in his control. She tightened her grip on the children and took a step forward, placing herself between them and him. "I trusted you," she said, voice calm but edged with steel. "And you lied. You thought I wouldn't see it, wouldn't fight. You thought your plan would go unchallenged." His lips curled into a faint, amused smile. "You were useful," he admitted. "Everything I did, everything I planned, it was to reach what I wanted. You and the children were keys to a door I meant to open." A howl of wind shook the cabin, rattling the door. She glanced at the children, then back at him, and something in her shifted. Fear had no hold here anymore, only the determination to protect, to end the threat that had invaded their lives. She moved suddenly, retrieving a long-handled axe from its resting place by the wall, her motion fluid and precise. He reacted immediately, drawing a knife and blocking her first strike with a practiced twist. Sparks flew as steel met steel, the firelight reflecting in both of their eyes, painting the cabin in shades of red and shadow. The fight was swift, brutal, and cinematic. She ducked under his swing, her movements sharpened by desperation and maternal instinct, the children's safety pressing her forward with an intensity that left no room for hesitation. Each strike she made carried a purpose, each block he attempted revealed his underestimation of her will. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within, snow thrashing against the walls, wind shaking beams and loose boards, adding a raw, natural percussion to the clash. She forced him back, using the momentum of the cabin and the leverage of the axe to her advantage, striking not with anger, but with precise intent to end his threat. He faltered only once, a microsecond of miscalculation, and she took it. The axe connected with a force that reverberated through the cabin, sending him crashing against the wall, the knife sliding from his grasp. He looked up at her, shock mingling with disbelief, a rare vulnerability flashing across his features. She stood over him, chest heaving, the children huddled behind her, safe for the first time in weeks. The storm outside began to wane, the wind still sharp but no longer as violent, as if nature itself acknowledged the shift of power within these walls. For a long moment, silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the shallow, rapid breaths of the woman. The rancher lay still, finally, and she allowed herself a slow exhale. The fight was over. The threat that had loomed like a shadow across their lives had been removed definitively. She sank to her knees, gathering the children into her arms, feeling the warmth of their small bodies, their trust and their unspoken love anchoring her in the aftermath. The storm outside softened into a gentle flurry, snow falling in slow, delicate arcs that reflected the first weak rays of sunlight piercing the gray clouds. The plain stretched endlessly beyond the cabin, white and pure, unbroken except by distant trees and the faint outline of hills. She stood by the door for a moment, taking in the sight, letting the vast emptiness of the frontier remind her of the freedom now within reach. The wind carried a crisp scent of pine and ice, mingling with the lingering warmth of the cabin, as though the land itself offered quiet congratulations for survival and courage. Inside, the cabin felt alive with possibility, the air no longer heavy with tension but tinged with a subtle thrill of victory and endurance. The children laughed softly, their voices rising above the crackling fire, and she felt the tight knot of fear and doubt unravel within her chest. She moved through the cabin, checking the fire, straightening blankets, ensuring everything was in place. Every small act was infused with new awareness. She was no longer merely surviving. She was claiming agency, staking a claim to life on her own terms. As afternoon light filtered through the windows, she sat with the children, letting them eat a warm meal, sharing quiet laughter and stolen smiles. She watched the snow fall in silence, thinking of the journey that had brought them here, of the danger they had survived, and of the man who had wielded kindness and cruelty in equal measure. The weight of the past weeks pressed lightly upon her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder of resilience and courage. The frontier had been harsh, unyielding, yet it had forged a strength in her that could not be undone. She prepared the children for the night, tucking them into their blankets and brushing snow from their hair. The cabin was warm, filled with the scent of fire and wood, safe in a way it had never been before. She lingered for a moment, watching their faces softened by sleep, and allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile. There would be hardships ahead, plains and storms were unrelenting, and the memory of betrayal would linger, but for now they were free. She had faced the threat, met it with courage, and emerged stronger. That night, she stepped to the door one last time, looking out across the snow-covered expanse. The first golden rays of sun began to warm the horizon, softening the whites and grays of the plains into hues of gold and amber. She breathed deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs, and felt the profound quiet of survival, the sweet triumph of freedom, and the unbroken promise of tomorrow. The wind still whispered, but now it carried no menace, only the sound of possibility, of paths open and journeys yet to take.